Well, hello everybody and welcome again to this Equipped course where we're looking at preaching. We're about halfway through the program now, so we're getting a little bit deeper, going a little bit further and further. And it feels so far, Ian, that we've looked a lot at kind of background, character, integrity, the hard work behind closed doors. I still want to be looking at behind closed doors today, but really looking practically, really looking at how is it that we can form this thing? How is it that this thing can be made up? So we're going to be looking at frameworks, and that's the big theme for today. So kick us off. Tell us, how is it that Ian Coffey writes his talks?
Well, if I tell you a true story about a guy who I worked with, who was part of the team at a church where I was serving, Nathan. And Nathan was developing as a preacher. But the struggle that he had was whenever he preached, it was like reading an essay. So I still remember one memorable night when we were doing a series on the minor prophets, people like Nahum and Haggai and Malachi. And I think it was Malachi he was preaching on. And it was immaculate. He had spent hours. He'd really worked very, very hard. He was working with us alongside his theological studies. And what he basically produced that evening was a brilliant essay. He'd have got 70 plus for the essay because he gave us, the background, the theories as to authorship and the dating and whatever the context. And the next day when we sat down to look at it together, I said, Nate, honestly, mate, you'd have got a 70 plus as an essay. But as a sermon on a Sunday night in Plymouth, it was probably about a 25. Why? And we realised as we unpicked it together and walked through it was he'd literally written an essay. He'd done the work and he'd written it all out. To compound it, he'd read it. So it was like reading an essay. So we then began to explore, how do you create a framework which makes something teachable? Now, what he was trying to do, and I've done the same thing, was to take everything that he'd read, everything that God had shown him out of the text, and dump it on everybody within the space of 25 minutes. And it was like, it's not going to work. So we started to work together on building a framework. And one of the things that you can do to help you with this is to stand back from all the work that you've done and ask two questions. What is the focus of this passage? And what is its function? Now, the focus means, what do I sense is the key point, the main thing that God wants me to get out of this passage? Not everything there is to know about Malachi, but what is the main point? And secondly, how am I going to apply it? What's its function? What do I sense the Holy Spirit saying to me about the application? And we're going to do a whole film on application a bit later. And that helped him, as it's helped me, to simply say, I haven't just got to download everything that I've prepared, but what's happening? What's God doing dynamically through handling Scripture? And I've talked about the word framework. Some people talk about the skeleton or the scaffolding, but it's the sort of drawing out the main point and then saying, well, how do I emphasize that? Working with the text, how am I going to actually communicate that to other people? Now, there are different methods that people use. The way I do it is I tend to have a bit of scrap paper near me. And on the scrap paper, I start to scribble things down. So as I'm thinking and praying it through, just sort of, in a sense, conversing with God, conversing with the text. How does that fit where we are at the moment as a church? And sometimes an outline will come very quickly to me. Now, there are some preachers that have to have 3 points that all begin with the same letter. It doesn't always work for everybody, but there may just be one thing, or there may be two things that come out of the passage. If you're one of these people who can put it into a real crisp statement, that's wonderful. It really is really helpful. But what you want to do is allow the content of the message to live with you so that you can then communicate that to people who are listening in.
So you talked within that around having that main point, that main focus, and know that there are amazing speakers who manage to interweave a whole bunch of different points at once, and I wish I was one of them, but I'm not. How is it that you create then? Lots of people do different ways and different formats. How is it that you do it? How is it that you create something that really does draw out that main point? Interesting you said draw out as well, because that implies that there's something before it that then leads to it, rather than starting off and throwing it out to everybody.
Yeah, it's in the text. I said about having a piece of paper next to me, scribbling it down. Sometimes it comes when I'm out and about walking. I've found that often when I have done a good chunk of preparation, if I go and do something else, it's the doing something else means that's the bit, the eureka moment. You remember Archimedes was sat in the bath and suddenly he worked out, oh, that's what displacement is. It's when you're doing something else that it can often come to you in that way. And I think it's worth wrestling with and thinking it through. I've been, like my young friend Nathan, I've been told afterwards, often by my wife Ruth, you tried to get too much into that. I know that I've done that, and it's not because I want to impress, because I really haven't spent time working out what's the heart. So focus and function. So when I'm working with students now, I'll actually get them to do that, to go away and do their work on the text, and then come back and give me in one sentence, what is the focus of my prep and what is the function? So the focus is, what am I going to take out of that passage that I believe God has given me to do? And the function is, what do I feel the application is going to be? And then around that, you can build illustrations. Again, we're going to do a film on that. You can build testimony. You can build links to other scriptures that are relevant, and you'll leave other stuff to one side. Now, the frustration there is you think, but I've got some great material here. Don't throw it away. Never throw stuff away, because you'll come back to it at another time for another sermon. So don't feel that you're cheating the congregation by not giving them everything that you've been reading about. They just can't cope with it. They end up with spiritual indigestion. So learning to hone it down so it's workable. You've got it into your head and your heart, and it will communicate to people in that way.
It feels like I've heard a lot before around having the boldness to include certain things, but actually I haven't heard as often the boldness to leave things out and to not hold things. Segueing slightly, I was watching a TV series with my friend Andy not so long ago, and one of the questions I had around it was how amazing it was that all of these episodes were exactly 20 minutes long, and they were so engaging and so brilliant and so consistent. And he was wiser than I was, and he said, they just follow a format. You know, they said, once you see the format, you can't unsee it. But they start with this, there's a middle section like this, they go into this kind of section here, and they always end like this. And as soon as you see it, you think, of course, that makes total sense as to why that happens. Is there an equivalent for the way in which you preach, or does it change every time? Is there a way in which you do consistently start? Is there something you do consistently look to have around the 15-minute mark? Is there a way in which you do look to sign off? What are some of the principles of that?
Well, I think if you're preaching to the same people every week, the risk of having a format is people will know the format and they'll pretty quickly work that out. This is the bit where Ian will do this, and then we move to this. So I think I don't recommend it. I think it's good to ring the changes. I've rung the changes over the years in the way that I write my sermons, the kind of note form that I use. I've changed partly because I just don't want to get into a rut. I want to keep fresh. But you've certainly got to have an introduction that introduces the theme. You need something to come out on, which is important, a landing point, and then the main course in the middle. And sometimes the introduction could be a story. I was preaching yesterday, and I started with a story of someone who worked as an intern in one of our churches who had a real challenge in her life. And then I came back to her story at the end. So she was the bookends, if I can put it that way. And the main teaching on the passage came in the middle. And it was all to do with not worrying, Jesus in Matthew chapter 6. But her story fitted perfectly as the bookends to that. There are other times when you might start with a question. You might say, have you ever wondered if there's something wrong with you because everyone else seems to get answers to prayer, but somehow or another you don't. You know, that kind of thing, that sort of question that opens up the topic. Well, you know, today we're looking at a psalm where that's what the psalmist felt. It's going well for everybody else, but life is rubbish for me. But that's the bit where I have the paper on the side, because for other people it would just like a series of scribbles, but I'll write up options which are coming through my mind thinking, oh, I could start with that. I could begin with this question. I could talk about this experience that happened to me the other day. And at the end, I'm doing a similar thing too. It'd be good to land it there. I argue when I'm teaching preaching that how you begin and how you end are really important. The bit in the middle is essential, but how you start and how you end are really important. You perhaps, Johnny, been in a situation where you felt the preacher's actually ended, but he's not ended, or she's not ended. They've just kept going on. I liken that to a plane circling, ready to come down. You think, right, okay, they're circling, they've got their undercarriage down, but they just can't land the jolly thing. And you need to know how to land it, which is why having this is my finishing point. Because some of us go blank towards the end, we're tired, we can see the congregation beginning to switch off. You think, well, at least if I get to that word of testimony, that illustration, that quote, however I'm going to end, I know where I'm going to finish. And similarly, you hear preachers who take about 10 minutes to get going. Whereas if you've worked hard on your intro, you know how to get into your topic quickly. And in terms of perfecting that, the best thing is to have people who are honest critics. And I've been glad to have in my life people who've been honest critics with me, where I've gone to them and said, look, I'm trying to learn to grow as a preacher. Will you help me? And they'll say, well, sometimes you take a long time to get going. Or they'll say, you take forever to end. You know, your sermon ended 10 minutes before, you know, you actually finished. And that's where feedback is so important. And we can try and evaluate ourselves, but we're not very good at self-criticism. We can either be too glowing or usually we beat ourselves up too much. But asking people, how did that work for you? Are there ways in which I can improve?
One of the people who we both know who was for me so valuable in this was Steve Fenning. Yeah. Steve was phenomenal at being able to articulate feedback. And I knew that if it was a little thing, it would be Monday morning, first thing, and it'd let me know. If it was a bigger thing, it would be on the golf course, I'd look forward to the golf, but I'd always, on the ninth hole, I'd be worrying what was going to come out about the Sunday that just went on. But Steve was fantastic at saying, actually, no, you were speaking too fast. You know, you need to pull it back, you need to slow down, or you lost me from here to there, or I could tell you were so looking forward to telling this story that actually that's really what the talk was. And the plane circling idea is perfect because you can have an amazing flight, you can have all the best service, but actually the thing you're going to remember is the 3 hour circling if that's all the other stuff gets lost. So one of the things that Steve, and we've mentioned before Duncan as well, really articulated brilliantly that I think you have as well is actually that start and end, the importance of those things. They used to call it the tension, the text, the to-do and the takeaway, which I think was quite nice. But within that, they were able to then utilize different ways of doing those things. So it wasn't stale, it wasn't samey every time, but it had a kind of a front and a back end that was so intentional. For you, thinking at the end of wrapping up, of finishing, how is it that you leave people walking away with one thing stuck in their mind?
I think there are different ways of doing it. Sometimes it's good just at the end of the sermon, you know, you've reached the end of it, say, let's have some quiet. If you've got a band that are competent at playing quietly, just asking folk to say, Lord, what do you want to say to me today? Brilliant. What do you want me to take away? Which takes the responsibility away from you making it happen, to allowing people just to have a few minutes quiet before God. I don't think we make, in the evangelical tradition, I don't think we make enough of silence and quiet, where God can speak in a remarkable way into our lives. Sometimes it's a question, where I might say, here's a question for you to think about this week. Maybe a couple of questions, no more than 3. And if I'm going to have 3 questions, I'll pop them up on a screen. Just take these away this week. And as you're thinking and praying and walking the dog, look at these questions. Sometimes it can be a a to-do. Why don't you go out this week and look at some way in which you can do an act of random kindness to someone who doesn't know Jesus? And again, it comes to you out of working with the text. Because if the text is speaking to you, then it's going to be speaking to others as well. And I'll say sometimes, you know, in my preparation this week to preach this message, I felt God say for me to do this. And maybe that's something that will help you. But encouraging a congregation always to be saying, Lord, I'm listening for you. When I'm teaching on preaching, one of the early lectures I give is how to listen to a sermon. Think about it, Johnny. How many times have you heard someone tell you how to listen to a sermon? You know, we rush into church, usually having a pretty frantic journey to get there. We chat to friends beforehand. We're into the early part of the service, the sung worship and so on. And then when we come to the sermon, our minds are usually, well, my mind is, if I haven't prepared properly, all over the place. But learning how to tune into God, to prepare our hearts and our minds to receive from God, and then also at the other end to know, again, how to prayerfully take what I've been listening and go out and apply it in my life that week. But that end point for me and the start point are critical.
Loved what you talked around at the start of that, around silence and actually the power of that. That can be quite a daunting thing.
Yes.
I've got a friend, Ben, who has a great phrase. He says breakthrough's often on the other side of awkward. Where actually it takes a little, you know, like being on a first date, it takes a little bit of awkwardness to get to a second one. But how is it that you can really utilise that? And how is it that you can give yourself the confidence to see a moment and really utilise it?
Well, I said about if you've got good musicians who can come up and just quietly play underneath, because for some people silence can be very frightening, whereas music that's played well and it's appropriate to what you're doing can just enable people to sit and be still. In our generation, our culture, we don't have a lot of stillness. We tend to, you know, you walk into a room and it's quiet and you switch a radio on. Because we need something there to fill the space. But I think it's a spiritual discipline, learning to listen to God. And certainly what your friend said is true. Significant things can happen in the silence. People will, you know, you may say, just ask God, going away from today, what are you going to do this week? And they'll say, well, do you know, in the silence, a person's name came to my mind, or their face came to me. I need to do something. I haven't heard from them for ages. I need to call them. I need to get in touch with them. And it is a spiritual discipline, but it can also move away from, as a preacher, manipulating. You know, this is the end outcome I want to see, so therefore I'm going to kind of put something together to make that happen. I often feel those moments are really holy, special, and I don't want to get in the way. This is a personal thing. Now I'm no longer a pastor of a church. When I'm preaching somewhere, sometimes the minister, the leader will say, feel free to close as you want to close. And I'll always push back and say, no, I'd rather you did. Because I feel I've done my job, I've done my task in delivering the word. You're much more in touch with the congregation. A couple of weeks ago where I was preaching, I touched on something in the course of my sermon. I had no knowledge of what was going on in the church that week. But when I handed back to the pastor, he was able to say, folks, you'll know how relevant that was. Ian didn't know about the meeting we had earlier this week and the things that we talked about. But this is a word from God for us. Now, I was so grateful that it wasn't me closing it down, but it was the pastor saying, look, this speaks to us as a church at this moment in time, and was able to very gently and sensitively apply it to them as a congregation.
I know that you brought to us a book a couple of episodes ago by Jonathan Lamb, and I know that there's some really brilliant stuff within this about this idea of frameworks. Quickly tell us a little bit about that as we come to an end.
I will. One of the things that I really admire about this book is he's got little templates. So this one here is a worksheet for understanding a Bible passage, which gives little columns that you can fill in. And although it sounds a bit basic, it's so helpful. From text to sermon, a little illustration of how that flows. And I don't know whether you remember, but when you were learning to drive, they teach you little mantras like mirror, signal, manoeuvre. Mirror, signal, manoeuvre. But when you've been driving for quite a bit of time, you do that automatically because it's got in there. And what I think Jonathan's done here is he's given us a template which helps us to get into the habit when we're reading the Bible and preparing to preach of knowing how to build the structure that you understand and you can convey to the congregation with the aid and the help of the Holy Spirit. So that's one of the reasons why I recommend this book.
Brilliant. So if you haven't already, do check that out. But do join us next time as we continue to talk around preaching. There's just so much to be looking at. So grateful for Ian for all the wisdom that you're bringing to this programme. So do check in with us next time. And as always, if you haven't already, if you haven't written one thing down that you've got from this last half hour or so, so that you can remember it, that you can use it, and so that tomorrow after you've had a good night's sleep, you can still continue to utilise what's been going on in these sessions, do make sure that you do that because it is the best way to remember something. So join us next time. Really glad that you're here with us and see you then.